The familiar tune of loneliness played out in my quiet Squirrel Hill home. It was a melody composed of small sounds: the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the old refrigerator, the gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. I stood over the stove, the rhythmic thunk of a knife against a cutting board filling the air as I chopped carrots for my evening soup. The scent of chicken broth and thyme was a small comfort, a ritual I'd perfected over 5 years of cooking for one. Then, the telephone rang, its shrill cry slicing through my domestic symphony like a blade. I saw Claire's name on the screen, and my shoulders lifted instinctively. Hope, that stubborn old weed, pushed through the cracks in my heart. Maybe she was calling just to chat, to ask about my day the way she used to. "Hi, Dad." Her voice carried that particular flatness I'd grown to dread, the one reserved for obligations. "Look, I can come to this Father's Day thing of yours, but not for long." The knife stopped mid-slice. The steam from my soup suddenly felt suffocating. "Of course, sweetheart." I forced a brightness I didn't feel. "I'd be happy to see you, even if it's just for a little while." "Right. Well, I'll probably drive over around noon on Sunday, but I can't stay past 3. I promised Helen and Richard I'd help them with their garden party in Sewickley." Their garden party, not our Father's Day. The words stung. I stirred the soup, the wooden spoon feeling heavier than it should. "That sounds lovely," I managed. Her visit felt like a transaction, a 3-hour time slot squeezed between more important engagements. The daughter who once spent entire weekends helping me in the garden now measured her time with me in minutes. The quiet of my living room called to me after the call. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as I pulled a worn leather album from the bookshelf. I opened it to a photo from a time before everything changed, before the steel plant downsized my life, before Helen left, before Richard Thorne existed. In the picture, Claire had her arm around my shoulder, her smile genuine and wide. We were a family, whole and unbroken. But the memories that followed were sharp-edged. The day the layoff notice came, the slow erosion of Helen's patience, her voice on the phone with him lighter, younger, a voice I hadn't heard in years. "He sees potential in me," she had said, as if the 32 years I'd spent supporting her dreams had amounted to nothing. My thoughts were interrupted by the sharp click of heels on my cracked concrete walkway. It was Claire. She never came unannounced. She strode up the path, a portfolio case in hand, wearing the kind of sharp blazer that meant business. "Dad," she said, her eyes sweeping over my grass-stained jeans, "we need to talk, seriously." In the living room, she spread charts and graphs across my coffee table like battle plans. "I've been developing something incredible, Dad. A digital marketing consultancy for legacy businesses here in Pittsburgh." Her eyes sparked with an excitement I hadn't seen in years, a fire I recognized because I was the one who had first kindled it. She pointed to revenue projections, client acquisition costs, profit margins, the language of a world that had moved on without me. "This is impressive, Claire. Really impressive," I said, and I meant it. "I know. But to launch properly, I need startup capital," she said, her voice dropping slightly as she prepared to deliver the payload. "I need $100,000. $100,000. The number hung in the air between us, an impassable chasm. It echoed the silence of the day I was let go from the steel plant, the day my world shrank to the size of a cardboard box filled with 30 years of personal effects. I remember my manager, a man half my age with an MBA and no calluses on his hands, explaining that my position had become redundant, as if a man's life work could be dismissed with a single sterile word. That same feeling of powerlessness washed over me now, watching my daughter's bright, hopeful face. "Dad, I know it sounds like a lot," she pressed on, mistaking my stunned silence for hesitation. "But this opportunity won't wait. There's another firm sniffing around the same market segment. If I don't move now, someone else will capture these clients." She was so much like me in that moment. The same fire, the same engineer's certainty in her own calculations. Her plan was meticulous, her research sound. She laid out spreadsheets showing client acquisition costs, projected monthly recurring revenue, and a clear path to profitability. She spoke of helping the old bakeries in the Strip District build an online presence, of giving the family-owned hardware stores in Bloomfield a fighting chance against Amazon. It was a good plan, a noble one even. It was a dream worthy of every sacrifice. And that was the problem. I was the father who had always made her dreams possible. The treehouse in the backyard, the tuition for Carnegie Mellon, the down payment on her first car. I had always been the one to say, "We'll find a way. Have you approached banks for a business loan?" I heard myself asking the practical questions while my mind reeled, desperately searching for an exit ramp from the inevitable collision course with reality. "Banks want established revenue history." She waved a dismissive hand, the gesture so much like her mother's. "Collateral I don't have. You know how conservative they are. But family investment is different. It's believing in potential, not just spreadsheets." She looked at me, her eyes filled with the same unwavering trust she'd had as a 7-year-old at the zoo, the hero who could carry her on his shoulders, the strongest man in the world. How could I tell her that the world had broken me? How could I explain that my strength had been rendered redundant? The words formed in my throat, the cold, hard truth. I don't have it. But looking at her, radiant with ambition, I couldn't say them. The failure of my past was one thing. The failure of her future was another. I'll try to figure something out, sweetheart," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. Her smile could have powered the entire city of Pittsburgh. "I knew you'd come through for me, Dad. You always do." She began gathering her materials, her movements now light and efficient. "I'll need to know by Sunday, though. Monday at the latest. The office space I want won't stay available for long." Sunday. Father's Day. The irony wasn't lost on me. I walked her to the door, watching her confident stride back to her Audi. She turned and waved, her face a perfect portrait of a daughter's faith in her father. The car disappeared around the corner, leaving me alone in my doorway, a business plan clutched in my dirt-stained hands. I had promised my daughter the moon when I could barely afford to keep the lights on. That evening, I retreated to my small home office, the room where the ghosts of my engineering career resided. Claire's business plan, full of bold projections and confident assumptions, sat beside my outdated computer. While the machine wheezed to life, I opened the filing cabinet labeled Financials and faced the numbers. 5 years of disciplined saving, of skipped restaurant meals and postponed repairs, had resulted in a modest pile of security. My primary checking account at PNC Bank held just over $3,000, enough to cover the monthly bills. The savings account, my shield against the unexpected, contained $18,550. In the small safe behind my desk, I had another $3,000 in emergency cash. The total came to $24,977. I rounded it up to $25,000, but the number refused to grow. It was a wall I couldn't climb, a victory that now felt like a profound failure. The next morning, I put on my best shirt and walked into the downtown Pittsburgh branch of my bank. The loan officer, a woman young enough to be Claire's sister, examined my paperwork with a professional sympathy that offered no hope. "Mr. Vance, your credit rating is adequate," she said, sliding the report across her polished desk. "But without a steady employment income, an unsecured loan of this magnitude is extremely difficult to approve." "What about a home equity line of credit?" I asked, my voice sounding thin in the cavernous, air-conditioned space. "That's possible," she conceded, "but the application process takes 4 to 6 weeks minimum. We'd need a current appraisal, income verification." Her voice faded as the timeline confirmed my fears. I thanked her for her time and walked out into the Saturday morning bustle of the city, feeling the $75,000 gap widen into a canyon. My last hope was Frank Kowalski. We'd worked the floor at the steel plant for 20 years before the layoffs scattered us like ashes. I found him at a small cafe in the Strip District, the air thick with the smell of coffee and fried onions. He listened patiently as I laid out my situation, his weathered face etched with a familiar sympathy. "Art, I'd help if I could, you know that," he said, stirring his coffee with a heavy hand. "But things are tight everywhere. My wife's medical bills last year wiped us out. I might be able to manage 2,000, maybe 3. I thanked him, and I meant it, but his words felt like trying to fill the ocean with a teaspoon. As I stood to leave, he put a hand on my arm, his expression turning serious. "Listen, Art," he said, his voice low. "That little girl of yours, she's in a different world now. You see it, don't you? She's with that Richard fella, living in Soically, wanting things that guys like us, we can't give her anymore." Ugh. I drove home through streets that had once felt like mine, the words of my oldest friend echoing in my head. He hadn't just told me he couldn't help. He had confirmed my deepest, most unspoken fear. The problem wasn't just the money. The problem was me. Back in the suffocating quiet of my house, I found myself standing before the glass-fronted cabinet in the dining room. Inside, the wedding china Helen had left behind sat in perfect, unused stacks. On the mantel, my father's modest collection of Timex watches from the 70s ticked away, their value purely sentimental. In my bedroom, a small wooden box held the few pieces of jewelry Helen hadn't taken, a string of cultured pearls, a silver locket. I had spent Saturday afternoon inventorying these small treasures, my last resort. The man at the antique shop had been kind but firm. 5,000, maybe, if I was patient and willing to sell my life in pieces. I imagined Claire's face if I presented her with a shoebox of cash and told her it was the sum total of our family's history. The thought was unbearable. I couldn't sell my soul for a fraction of what she needed. Some things had a price too high to pay. That night, sleep was a stranger. I lay in the dark, the house creaking around me, and rehearsed the speech I would have to give. Sweetheart, I tried. I moved heaven and earth, but it wasn't enough. Each version sounded more pathetic than the last. The words were a confession of failure, an admission of the inadequacy that Richard Thorne's very existence seemed to highlight every day. How do you tell your daughter the hero she once believed in is just an old man with an empty bank account? Sometime before dawn, a new plan formed, born of desperation and love. If I couldn't give her the money, I would give her a memory. I would cook. I would fill this empty house with the aromas of her childhood, a fortress of nostalgia against the harsh realities of the present. I would make the herb-crusted roast she used to love, the garlic mashed potatoes that were more butter than potato, the chocolate chip cookies we used to bake together on rainy Sunday afternoons. I would show her, in the only language I had left, that I loved her. Father's Day morning was a flurry of deliberate, focused activity. I scrubbed the floors, polished the silver, and set the dining room table for two with the good china. The scent of roasting garlic and rosemary filled the air, a fragrant defiance against the looming disappointment. I worked with the precision of an engineer designing a bridge, each step calculated to create a perfect, welcoming space. Everything had to be just right. This meal, this small offering, had to stand in for the $100,000 I did not have. At 11:55, I stood in the center of my home, a humble king in a spotless, fragrant castle. The roast was resting, the potatoes were warm, and the table was a portrait of a father's love. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe this would be enough. Maybe when she saw all the effort, all the care, she would understand. At exactly noon, the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on my apron, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked to the door with a smile I had practiced in the hallway mirror. I was ready to face my daughter. I was ready to explain. I opened the door, and the world I had so carefully constructed fell apart. 3 figures stood on my doorstep. My hand gripped the doorframe as reality shifted beneath my feet. Claire beamed at me from the center, but flanking her like bookends were Helen and Richard. My ex-wife looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting anywhere but at my face. The man who had replaced me surveyed my property with the cool, appraising gaze of someone pricing livestock. "Surprise, Dad," Claire chirped, oblivious. "I brought Mom and Richard." The words hit me like cold water. I stumbled back a step, my carefully planned day dissolving into a nightmare. "Hi, Winfred." Helen's voice was a strained whisper of cheerfulness. Richard stepped past me without invitation, his gaze sweeping across my modest front hallway. "Interesting little place you have here," he said. "Very cozy." Cozy, the word rich people use to mean small and insignificant. "Of course," I heard myself saying, the muscle memory of politeness taking over. "Please, come in." They filed into my living room, and the space I'd always found adequate suddenly felt cramped and shabby. Richard moved with the confidence of ownership, touching the spine of a book, adjusting a picture frame, before settling into my chair, as if he belonged there. Isn't this perfect? Claire twirled in the center of the room. All my family together for Father's Day. All her family. The phrase completed my demotion. I was no longer the patriarch, just a member of the supporting cast in her new, expanded production. I retreated to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I pulled 2 more plates from the cabinet. The turkey I'd carved for an intimate meal might just stretch to feed 4 if I sliced it thin enough. Through the doorway, I watched Richard examine my bookshelves, his posture radiating a quiet condescension. He was mapping my territory with the thoroughness of a general planning an occupation. The dining room I had set so carefully for 2 now looked pathetic. As they arranged themselves around the table, the hierarchy was established without a single word. Richard took the head of the table, my seat. Agnes sat beside him, naturally gravitating into his orbit. Helen took the chair opposite, leaving me the remaining seat at the foot of my own table. "This looks delicious, Winfred," Helen offered, her forced brightness painful to hear. "Turkey's a bit dry," Richard observed after his first bite, dissecting the meat with surgical precision, "but not bad for home cooking. Easy mistake to make without the proper equipment." Every word was a small, sharp blade. "Curious how you manage such a big house alone," he continued, his eyes cataloging the room. "Must be quite a challenge maintenance-wise. Economic efficiency would suggest something more compact." Claire laughed, the sound sharp and jarring. "Richard's always thinking about optimization. It's what makes him so successful. Unlike your father." The words went unsaid but hung in the air between us. I focused on my plate, the meal I had prepared with such love now tasting like sawdust. The conversation continued around me, a performance of blended family harmony orchestrated by my daughter. They talked about their upcoming trip to Sonoma, about the new landscaping at the Sewickley house, about a world of effortless wealth that I no longer belonged to. I was a ghost at my own feast, present only as a relic of a life Claire had long since outgrown. The store-bought apple pie was a sad sequel to the meal, its sweetness failing to mask the bitter undercurrents at the table. As Lula and Claire cleared the dessert plates, Richard leaned back in my chair, a look of serene satisfaction on his face. Claire returned from the kitchen and checked her watch, then exchanged a brief, meaningful glance with him. My stomach tightened. This wasn't a spontaneous afternoon. This was a scheduled performance, and the final act was about to begin. "Actually, Claire," Richard began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket with a theatrical flourish. "Before we get too comfortable, I have something for you." He withdrew a folded check and placed it on the table with the deliberate precision of a card player revealing a winning hand. The paper made a crisp, authoritative sound against my worn dining table. Even upside down, I could see the amount written in his confident, flowing script. $100,000. Claire gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. This, at least, was not part of the script for her. Her shock was genuine. "Richard, I can't believe it." She launched herself from her chair and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. When she pulled back, tears of pure joy streamed down her cheeks, washing away any trace of the polite tension from the meal. "Thank you," she sobbed, clutching his hand. "Thank you, Dad. You're such a real father." A real father. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. 33 years of my life, of my love, erased in a single ecstatic sentence. All eyes in the room, even Helen's, turned to me. They were waiting for my reaction, my applause, my concession. In the ringing silence, a pathetic, truthful confession escaped my lips. "I have $25,000, I whispered. That's everything I have." Claire spun toward me, her face transforming in an instant. The joy vanished, replaced by a look of pure, undiluted contempt that I had never seen before. "25,000? She laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. It was sharp and cruel as broken glass. "That's it? That's what 33 years of your fatherhood gets me?" "Sweetheart, the bank's my friends." I started, but she was already moving toward me, her eyes blazing with a lifetime of accumulated disappointment. "You never loved me." The accusation exploded from her. All these years I thought you cared, but you can't even manage what Richard does without thinking twice. He is my real father. He proves it every day while you just sit in this sad little house counting pennies. Ugh. The slap came so fast I didn't see her hand move. The sharp crack echoed through the small dining room like a gunshot. A bright, searing pain exploded across my cheek, and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth where my tooth had cut my lip. The coffee cup beside my plate overturned, its dark contents spreading across the white tablecloth like a final, damning stain. And then, silence. Absolute and complete. The house seemed to hold its breath in the ringing silence that followed the slap. My cheek throbbed, a dull, spreading heat. Richard sat frozen in my chair, his performance forgotten. Helen's hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that was years too late. Claire stood before me, chest heaving, her face a mask of triumphant rage. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my napkin and dabbed the corner of my mouth. It came away stained with a single drop of bright red blood, evidence of a line that had been crossed. I folded the napkin, placed it on the table, and pushed my chair back. I rose to my full height, not with anger, but with a strange, hollow calm. All the pain, all the years of quiet humiliations, had coalesced into a single, hard point of clarity. I looked directly into my daughter's furious eyes. "You're right, Claire," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm not your real father." The words landed in the silent room with the force of an explosion. The defiant anger on Claire's face wavered, crumbling into confusion. "What?" she stammered. "What are you talking about? You're lying." Her eyes darted to her mother, pleading for a denial. But Helen could only shake her head, tears already streaming down her cheeks. "We took you from the St. Jude's Home for Children when you were 2 years old," I continued, my voice unwavering. The story, locked away for 3 decades, now came pouring out. Your birth parents couldn't care for you. Social services placed you with us. You were a tiny, scared little thing, clinging to a worn-out stuffed rabbit with one ear. I could see the memory flicker behind Claire's eyes, not of the event, but of the rabbit, an object she'd kept on her bed until she was a teenager without ever knowing where it came from. "We loved you from the first moment we saw you," I said, the engineer in me laying out the facts with methodical precision. "Biology is an accident, Claire. Fatherhood is a choice. It's a choice you make every day. When you had nightmares about the place before us, I was the one who sat by your bed. When you scraped your knee, I was the one who bandaged it. When you graduated from college, my heart was the one that nearly burst with pride. None of it was required by blood. It was required by love." "It's true, sweetheart," Helen finally whispered, her voice choked with tears. We wanted to tell you, but it was never the right time." Claire's legs seemed to give way. She groped blindly for her chair, missed, and stumbled back against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor. Her expensive blazer was wrinkled, her perfect hair disheveled. All the armor she had worn into my house was gone, leaving only a terrified, confused woman in its place. The check, the symbol of her victory, lay forgotten on the table, its value utterly meaningless in the face of a truth that had just redefined her entire existence. For a long moment, Claire remained on the floor, her sobs the only sound in the heavy silence. They weren't the frustrated, angry tears of before, but the deep, ragged breaths of a soul coming apart. 33 years of her life, a history she thought she knew, had been rewritten in less than a minute. I stayed kneeling beside her, giving her the space to break. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears and mascara. The contempt was gone, replaced by a raw, bewildered agony. "All this time," she whispered, her voice cracking. Every memory." She looked at her own hands, turning them over as if they belonged to a stranger. It was the right hand, the one that had struck me, that she stared at with dawning horror. "You chose me," she said, not as a question, but as a staggering realization. "When my own parents couldn't, you chose me." "You were never not my blood, Claire," I said gently, my voice thick with an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. "You became my blood the moment I signed those papers. Biology is just the starting point. Love is what makes a family real." That was what finally broke her. She let out a cry of such profound grief and shame that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. She struggled to her knees and reached out, her trembling fingers gently touching the red mark on my cheek. "Oh, God, what have I done?" she choked out. "Forgive me, Dad." The word Dad sounded different now. It was no longer a name, but a title she finally understood she had no right to, and yet desperately needed. "I compared you to him," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "Like money was love, like providing was the same as caring. I hit you. I struck the man who saved me from an orphanage." I pulled her into my arms, and she collapsed against my shoulder, clinging to me with a desperate intensity. It was the embrace of someone who had nearly lost everything and had only just realized its true value. I held her, smoothing her hair the way I had when she was a small, frightened child, and simply let her cry. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into my shirt, "for hitting you, for saying such terrible things, for not seeing what you really gave me." "There's nothing to forgive," I murmured into her hair, the words feeling truer than anything I had ever said. "You're my daughter. That means loving you, even when you forget who we are to each other." We stayed like that for a long time, two broken people finding their way back together on the floor of a dining room, surrounded by the ruins of a disastrous Father's Day meal that had somehow, impossibly, become the best one of my life. Across the room, Richard Thorne sat in my armchair like a king, whose kingdom had just vanished in a puff of smoke. The $100,000 check, his ultimate display of power, lay on the table between us, a piece of paper that had caused a wound and could now offer no healing. Helen hovered near the doorway, a ghost in her own past, her face a canvas of regret. I helped Claire to her feet. She was shaky, but a new kind of strength seemed to settle in her shoulders. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, took a deep breath, and walked over to the dining table. Her movements were no longer the sharp, aggressive strides of the businesswoman, nor the frantic motions of her emotional breakdown. They were calm, deliberate. She picked up the check, holding it for a long moment. Then she turned to Richard, who was now studying the intricate patterns on my area rug with an intensity he had previously reserved for my financial shortcomings. "Richard," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "thank you for this. I know you were trying to help me, and I appreciate the gesture more than you know." He looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes, perhaps thinking his money could still salvage the situation. "But I can't accept it," she said, placing the check gently back on the table. "Not like this." She took another breath, choosing her words with a care I hadn't seen from her all day. I think I need to start smaller. Build something myself, on my own terms. Something real." The final word hung in the air, a quiet indictment of the hollow values he had tried to impose on our family. He simply nodded, his usual confidence completely gone. The man who had an opinion on everything from turkey to property taxes was finally speechless. Helen moved toward the door, her purse clutched like a shield. "Perhaps we should go," she said softly. "Give you two some space." Before she left, she paused and looked at me, her eyes filled with a sorrow that spanned decades. "I'm sorry, Arthur," she whispered, "for everything." I gave a slight nod, an acknowledgement of a pain too old and complex to address now. Richard rose from my chair and followed her out, a silent, defeated man, leaving a territory he had failed to conquer. The front door closed behind them with a soft click, and for the first time all day, the house was quiet. Claire and I stood alone in the dining room. The uninvited guests were gone. The disastrous meal was over. The check, the catalyst for so much pain, sat on the table, an inert and meaningless artifact. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the peaceful silence. The war was over. We stood in the quiet house, the silence no longer empty, but filled with 33 years of unspoken truths. Claire finally broke it, her voice soft. "Tell me about them. My birth parents." I led her to the sofa, and we sat down, the worn cushions sighing under our weight. I told her what little we knew, that they had been young, unable to provide for her, and had made the most difficult choice a parent could make, hoping she would find a better life. "And you found me," she whispered. "We found each other," I corrected gently. We talked for over an hour, a real conversation, the kind I had been starving for 5 years. She asked questions. I gave answers. We didn't try to fix everything at once, but the foundations of a new, more honest relationship were being laid right there in my living room. Finally, she stood up and walked back to the dining table. She picked up the check from Richard. For a heartbreaking second, I thought she might keep it. She looked at the 6 figures, a shortcut to the life she thought she wanted. Then she looked at me. She held my gaze as she walked calmly into the kitchen. I heard the sound of tearing paper. Once, twice, 3 times. She returned empty-handed, leaving $100,000 of someone else's validation in the trash can where it belonged. She came and knelt in front of my chair, taking my old, calloused hands in hers. "I have 3 hours until I have to be at that garden party," she said, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "But I'm not going." Tears welled in my eyes. "What will you do instead?" "I was thinking," she said, squeezing my hands, "that I'd like to spend the rest of the day with my father. Maybe we could look at some of those old photos you mentioned." She leaned forward and hugged me, her arms wrapped around my neck just as they had been in the old photograph from the zoo. "Happy Father's Day, Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with tears but clear and true. "My real father." Then, later that evening, long after she had gone, I sat in my armchair, her words echoing in the peaceful quiet. The house no longer felt small or shabby. It felt like a home again. The road ahead of us would be long, filled with more conversations and the slow work of rebuilding. But for the first time in years, I felt certain we would walk it together. The pain of this day had been immense, but it had been a cleansing fire, burning away the resentment and lies to reveal the simple, unbreakable truth that had been there all along. I was her father, and she was my daughter. It was a love built not on biology or bank statements, but on a choice made 33 years ago and reaffirmed today, in the heart of our imperfect, fractured, and finally, real family. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.